My first video on this channel was about how I really enjoyed The Last Jedi. I didn't think it was perfect, and I even agree with the criticisms of people who didn't like the movie, but the good things made up for the bad things in my book. But then I saw The Rise of Skywalker, and I hated it. It retroactively ruined the entire trilogy for me. I'm someone who actually liked these films. I was on your side, Disney. And what'd you do? You screwed it up.
I was your only friend. Yet one friend.
So bad I was gonna make a series of videos rewriting it. But the more I wrote, the more I had to rewrite, and not just with this movie. No, I started seeing the cracks in the entire trilogy, with Disney's overall direction of the franchise as a whole.
Tell us that we have a plan, that there's hope.
This thing was rotten to the core.
A rabbit cur.
The garbage fire of Rise of Skywalker exploded from a time bomb that's been ticking since The Force Awakens. So, as someone who used to like these films, let's talk about where they don't work so well. And then I can put Star Wars behind me forever and live my life. I have two big problems with how Disney approached the franchise. The first is that Star Wars no longer feels like a universe anymore. Disney cares a lot about the stars, but very little about the wars. They care about the individual characters, but they don't really explain anything about the world they inhabit, and I mean like basic things. Like, what's the deal with the First Order? The movie claims that after the Empire, there's a new republic. So how did a bunch of Empire wannabes get the tools they needed to A, reliably steal enough children to build an army?
I'm a stormtrooper. Like all of them, I was taken from a family I'll never know and raised to do one thing.
And B, get enough resources to build a new Death Star and rise to power without this new republic squashing it. And I mean, even just Leia and Luke, like what did everyone do for 30 years while these guys were stealing their kids? And this stuff was set up in the other trilogies. Compare the lack of setup in The Force Awakens to the expert setup in A New Hope.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
What's this?
In the first hour, we not only get good drama and character development, but we also get a rundown of how things work in this universe. The Force, the Jedi, all that good stuff.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
But we also build up the universe a bit. For example, let's take a look at how A New Hope sets up its villain, the Empire. We established visually the Empires as the ones in charge and the rebels as hopelessly outmatched. We see the ruthless power of the Empire when they destroy Alderaan not for tactical reasons, but just as like a move.
In a way, you have determined the choice of the planet that'll be destroyed first.
Luke and Obi-Wan are forced to go through an Empire checkpoint to get to a sketchy cantina and hire someone to smuggle them off a planet, all of which establishes the Empire as omnipresent. None of this development slows the story down. It's all just implied from the plot. But it results in a clearly defined set of stakes you can focus on, which makes you care more about what's going on, and it raises the tension of the overall conflict. And it also makes the story feel a bit less forced. The drama and meaning of the story feel like a happy accident that you can explore, rather than a universe compromised so that drama can happen. So the whole thing feels more natural. But we don't really get any of this in the new trilogy, and as a result, a lot of the drama in these movies feels like it's just there for its own sake and not a natural result of the universe that's built around it, which ends up drawing more attention to the creative process than the actual story being told. And this is why a lot of the drama can feel a bit forced. Like, look at this garbage. It could have been more than just a wacky action scene. It could have established something about the conflict. Maybe the space pirates worked for the First Order and Han had a bounty on him or something. Or maybe the First Order was there. Or maybe Phasma or Kylo. Maybe we could have had a standoff between Kylo and Han before we knew that Han Solo was his father, which would have been a cool, like, aha moment later for future rewatches. Maybe have Kylo mock Han about how he and Leia were not able to stop the outer systems from trying to rebuild or something. You know, something that establishes the conflict of the trilogy a bit through the character development and conversations.
Take a few moments to get the coordinates from the navigator computer.
You kidding? The rate they're gaining?
Traveling through hyperspace ain't like dust and crops, boy. Without precise calculations, we'd fly right through a star or bounce too close to a supernova and that'd end your trip real quick, wouldn't it?
But we don't really get any of this in the new trilogy. Instead, we get Foster's Home for Imaginary Rejects and space pirates. Cool. Now, I know that not everything needs to be about the plot, but these sequel trilogy movies rarely establish the universe at large or what's going on, so I can't help but look at scenes like this as wasted potential. Even worse than that, though, is when this limits the stories the film is actually trying to tell. For example, a lot of the characters in this trilogy don't really address or respond to the universe around them very much, and it results in a lot of plot points and themes falling flat. For example, look at Han and Leia. How do they feel about their failure to stop the First Order? Not how do they feel about their son becoming Little Goblin Jr.,
Look at little Goblin Jr. Gonna cry?
I mean, specifically, how do they feel about the First Order as an entity rising to power on their watch? The answer is we don't really know. Not even Luke brings them up. Luke, whose entire story is about a hero falling from grace and rising up to save the day and beat the First Order, doesn't mention any history with the First Order. It's just a little weird when you come back to it. It's like all these stories are like disconnected from the actual war going on. In fact, no one in this trilogy really talks about the last 30 years. It's like since we didn't see it, neither did they. Like the state of the universe doesn't affect them emotionally, but this makes no sense. People develop in response to their environment. I know a lot of people were upset that Luke was changed from his original trilogy self, but honestly, not only do I disagree with those people, but I think that Han and Leia should have been just as changed as Luke was. Now, you can still have flashback scenes if you want to show the entire cast and crew happy and having fun together for fan service as like a little last hurrah adventure. But as far as what's happening in the present, they should have been dramatically changed by how badly they failed the galaxy. Either obsessed and guilty like Luke was, or angry at those who stopped them from preventing it, or in denial that they were part of the problem. But no.
You changed your hair.
Same jacket.
Han and Leia get to be these perfect paragons because it's Star Wars. Don't you remember Star Wars, your favorite characters? And because the conflict doesn't seem to impact our characters, it doesn't really resonate with a lot of the audience. Rey suffers from this maybe more than any other character. I actually really liked her arc in the first two movies, someone learning that you don't have to be part of some royal family with some special blood to be special, and power comes from within, from conquering your demons, not from being part of something and whatever. What I want to know is, how does Rey feel about literally anything else other than her feelings? What stakes does she have in this war? Is she really only there because her parents left her and she's looking for a purpose? The answer is we don't know. We see her be nice to the robot and shoot at the evil people, so we just assume that she's vaguely a good person. She's hardly even a part of the conflict. It's like this whole war is going on and Rey is just in space Europe, finding herself before she goes to Jedi college. Compare this to the original trilogy. We see that Luke is pretty eager for some action of any kind and he just wants to get off his crappy planet and go on an adventure.
And if these new droids do work out, I want to transmit my application to the Academy this year.
You mean the next semester before the harvest? Harvest is when I need you the most. This year we'll make enough on the harvest that I'll be able to hire some more hands, and then you can go to the Academy next year. You must understand I need you here, Luke.
But it's a whole nother year. I want to come with you to Alderaan. There's nothing for me here now. I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
And then...
That's good. You've taken your first step into a larger world.
We see his view of the war change when Obi-Wan is killed. He wants revenge. And then in the end, when he's in the X-Wing, We see that he uses the Force to destroy the Death Star, and we start to see him believe in something larger than himself. That continues into the second movie, and then by the third movie, he's matured, he's grown. His view on the war has changed. Luke had personal stuff he was going through as well, but he was active in the conflict of the movie, and we knew how he felt about it. As a result, he felt less isolated from the plot of the movie, his journey felt more natural, but also we cared more about the plot of the overall trilogy. It feels like Luke's journey was a natural result of the universe, and that Luke's journey played into the universe, like the stuff he did mattered. Meanwhile, in the sequel trilogy, all the characters' stories feel completely independent of all the others and the state of the universe as a whole. So each movie in this trilogy feels less like a cohesive vision and more like 3 different movies that occasionally have crossover episodes. Every character feels like they're making a guest appearance whenever they're beside another character. Nothing feels cohesive, nothing feels connected. A really popular example of how the universe can limit the storytelling is with Finn. Finn was a child stolen from his parents at a young age to be a soldier in the First Order, and yet none of that comes up in his personality at all. And very rarely is it even brought up in his actual story. Yes, in The Last Jedi, he has an arc where he goes from someone who looks out for himself to someone who's invested in the fight, but that story isn't dependent on his history as a stormtrooper. We know this because we've seen this arc before. You could have had him be a prisoner of the First Order, and aside from like 1 or 2 lines, "Traitor!" it'd be the exact same story. But no. The only thing his stormtrooper background is used for is plot conveniences and a rivalry that doesn't really go anywhere. Because the state of the universe doesn't impact Finn, neither does his story that relies on the universe. The best way to not have these jarring disconnects happen is to develop the universe and the characters' connections to it. And this sort of segues into my next point, because this lack of development of the world wouldn't be such a big deal if Disney wanted this trilogy to be a simple space adventure franchise, but they don't. This trilogy is taking place with already existing characters who let the galaxy go into the trash compactor just after saving it. It deals with soldiers stolen as children, orphans with abandonment issues, emotionally compromised teens being sucked into cults. This trilogy, even though in a lot of ways it is for all ages, is trying to be complicated. It's trying to be a more adult Star Wars tackling these complex issues. But because the context for these issues isn't developed at all, the issues themselves fall flat. The stories that Disney are trying to tell are limited by the lack of world building. For another example of this, let's look at the Canto Bight scene in The Last Jedi. On paper, it was a pretty bold and thought-provoking statement for the world's most mass-appeal blockbuster franchise. The good guys and the bad guys both feed into the war machine of the galaxy because they both exist in a system that profits off of it. But a lot of people hated it. Why? Because Disney hasn't developed the universe that this war machine affects. So the only context we do have for this message is the real-world politics allegory, which makes the whole thing feel like heavy-handed, like someone is just using Star Wars terms to tell us about why capitalism is bad, instead of the universe and the story itself naturally implying that message. Again, it feels forced. For another example, we can go back to The Last Jedi and one of its central themes. No one is above failing, and your heroes aren't perfect. So take from them what works, but challenge what doesn't. And we sort of see this with Luke. He's criticized for screwing up with Kylo. But beyond that, none of the old heroes are criticized. Luke isn't criticized for letting the First Order rise to power, neither are Han and Leia. Han especially is never confronted on running away from the fight in the same way Luke is.
Chewie, we're home.
Why did he run away anyway? To smuggle? Isn't he royalty from marrying Leia? Why does he even need the smuggle? Is it like Walter White where he's doing it for the thrill?
I'm in the Empire business.
In the third movie, Lando is never questioned about why he was just chilling in the desert while people were being killed, despite apparently having the ability to rile up the entire galaxy to fight whenever he wants to. And while we hear about how Leia is buying her ships from sketchy people, she's never called out for it. It's like they bring up the plot point about how the Resistance is buying ships from the same people that the Empire are, or the First Order, sorry. But after the plot point is brought up, nothing. It's just dropped. How does Leia feel about that? Does she even know she's doing it? If so, does she see it as perpetuating the war machine, as a necessary sacrifice? Does she know what she's doing at all? What about Poe, who's being groomed as Leia's successor? How does he feel? Heck, we don't even get an opinion on it from Finn and Rose, the people who found this information out. When they figure it out, they just stare into space awkwardly on the ship and we're like, yeah, it's problematic, I guess, but what can you do? The movies never address it because doing so would require them to care about the universe and our heroes' connections to it. Now, some of you may say, well, that's not Rian Johnson's fault. That's the fault of JJ because he could have picked up those threads and used them in The Rise of Skywalker. And fair enough, but the worst offender of this betrayal of the theme of this franchise is everyone's favorite part of The Last Jedi.
Tell us that we have a plan, that there's hope.
The Poe and Holdo arc. It's essentially the exact opposite of the theme of criticizing the older generation. It's the newer generation that tries to criticize the older generation for seemingly falling asleep at the wheel, only for that older generation to have been right all along. And yeah, it's supposed to be a commentary on respecting women in places of authority too, which is a fine story anywhere else but in a film about challenging authority. You're priming me to think, I wonder what's wrong with this one. And then it turns out that she's right, and it's supposed to be like a, see, you didn't trust her, confront your biases. And it's like, I trusted you to be consistent with your theme. Anyway, when you try to tackle these complicated themes, it creates questions. And if you don't have answers for these questions, it feels really awkward. It'd be easier to answer these questions if our characters were better connected to the overarching story and our world and anything other than their feelings, but they aren't, so the themes don't hit as hard as they could have. And that applies to everything else too. Finn wanting to just look out for himself and get away from the First Order would hit a lot harder if we knew anything about the First Order. Poe learning to think about more than just winning the war would have a lot more punch if we knew anything about the war. Even Rey's story could be improved by this. Imagine if we had the exact same intro scene for Rey, except the people giving her barely enough rations to survive is a First Order general. Maybe her scrapping job is some sort of First Order slave colony thing. And you learn more about how they got more powerful or whatever, like from some other slaves talking. It's the same movie, except now she has a connection to the First Order. Little things like this can go a long way to making the story feel more connected and the conflict feel more meaningful. Maybe with Finn, we could have had Phasma tracking him down like a bounty hunter rather than just a leader that occasionally shows up to get wrecked. Maybe with Poe, we could have had Holdo be a younger person, someone who was second in command to him after Leia died, and they could have conflicted and it'd be like a newer generation versus a newer generation that also has new ideas. Little things like this can really make your themes, but when you don't think about these things, the big emotional moments in your story can fall flat. When the First Order blew up planets in The Force Awakens, I felt nothing. When our heroes killed stormtroopers, even though we know that they're child soldiers forced into service and not clones, I felt nothing. When in Rise of Skywalker, a planet was blown up, I genuinely laughed. The only stakes that planet had was Babu Frick and the Power Ranger chick, and then they come back in the end, so, you know, it's fine. Can we stop and think about how screwed up that is? The film is basically saying, yeah, sure, billions of lives and entire cultures were wiped out, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that the Power Ranger chick is alive. That's the important thing. Everyone else can just go, I'm fine with the world being a means to an end for our characters. But in Disney's Star Wars, the world is such a means to an end, it's too shallow to support the end it is meaning to. In Disney's Star Wars, it's not even just that like the world doesn't exist. It's like it aggressively doesn't exist. Like, it's like the only thing that matters is these handful of characters. It's not just that they get most of the focus. It's that they're the only things in this universe, and everyone else is just cardboard cutouts meant to serve them on their LARPing adventures. We barely know how any of these characters feel about the massive things happening around them, and it's jarring. Everyone's problems in the sequel trilogy are like purely personal. They're mostly divorced from the universe they're in. It's about Luke being a meanie, or Poe not respecting women, or not having parents, or having bad parents, or whatever. The completion of these arcs don't really affect anything beyond the main character's moods, with very, very few exceptions. It's like all the heroes and the villains of this film are like fighting amongst each other, and then there's also this war going on in the background between two groups of nameless soldiers. Like, who cares? The whole conflict of this trilogy feels less like a natural continuation of the Star Wars saga and more like a cynical cash grab meant to make Disney a gazillion dollars. And I mean, it is that, but a good movie will make you forget about that for 2.5 hours. The universe and the world building and the stuff in the movie, the context, these are the threads obscuring the hero's journey. Without them, your whole story feels less like an adventure and more like a thought exercise. It's more like, I wonder what people will think about this theme in this hero's journey movie. It doesn't feel real. This is probably what people mean when they say it doesn't feel like Star Wars. Because while we know a lot about the stars, we're missing their connection to the wars. But hey, since Disney put all their focus into the stars, the drama must be pretty good, right? Well, no. Which leads me to my second problem. The drama is not characterized well, and it's empty, and it's contradictory, and it's just bad. And again, the best example of this is the character of Rey. But to do that, we need to do something bold, something original. Comparing Rey's arc to Luke Skywalker's. Let's talk about Luke's arc. Luke was someone who wanted to go on an adventure and get away from it all. Through his journey, he learned how to be a more mature person who's more in control of himself, more knowledgeable of himself, who better understands the world around him. He started off naive, immature, and weak. Whenever he tried to be a too-cool-for-school hero, he failed. But when he was in control, when he knew who he was and he was authentic, that's where true confidence comes from. And as a result, he got more powerful. It was a simple, clean arc. Rey's main arc in this trilogy, on paper, is honestly the exact opposite of Luke's arc. It's not about gaining power. It's more about her controlling the power she already has and getting over her parents leaving her. It's not about someone desperate to escape, but someone who's desperate to stay.
For my family. They'll be back. One day.
But that is swooped up on an adventure anyway. She may not want to end up being someone unimportant, someone without a life. And she's, on some level, excited to kind of go on an adventure generally.
This is a Millennium Falcon. You're Han Solo.
But she's dragged down by her past and stuck in place. Then, destiny is thrusted onto her, and she eventually gains the courage to see where this journey can lead and step away from her parents for a little bit. Rey's search for her parents is her way of making them leaving her mean something beyond just a cruel act. Again, this is on paper. We're talking about execution later on. In The Last Jedi, she still has this motivation, except instead of following it by waiting on Jakku, she follows it by trying to train to be a Jedi. If she's a super cool hero who...
Show me my place in all this.
Then maybe everything she went through was worth it in the end. And then it turns out that she wasn't a cool hero. I think she had a feeling all along, but maybe didn't fully remember or didn't want to accept it. I think it's implied that Kylo either read her mind or has a feeling too, and that's why he says it out loud too. So she has a choice to either wallow in her suffering like Kylo or lick her wounds and move on like an adult, and she chooses the latter. Yay! Then, in Rise of Skywalker, she has no arc, and then she's a Palpatine, and she wants the Jedi to connect with her or something. I don't know. It's dumb.
I'd rather not do this now.
Yeah, me too.
But anyway, that's her arc in all three movies. This is all well and good, in theory, but there are two big problems with it in execution. The first is that Rey is a different character than Luke, but she's wearing his story. Despite being the opposite of Luke, her journey is very, very similar to his, and she doesn't fit it. She's in a sort of quasi-hero's journey action-adventure film like Luke was, and in that type of story, character growth is meant to happen through action. This is why, despite enjoying the big idea version of the arc Rey goes on, I get really bothered when people compare her to Luke to justify the film's shortcomings. Luke had a completely different arc from Rey. It was a simpler one, and a product of the type of story that George Lucas wanted to tell, one that allowed for development to occur in the fight scenes. Luke was a weakling, then he gets braver and gets more skilled, then he sees Obi-Wan die and gets angry and even more powerful, then he learns to use the Force and let go of his emotion, and instead beat the bad guys because they're bad and not because they killed his friend, which makes him even more powerful. And then, when he does that, he makes the impossible shot and wins. The action and the character development are happening at the same time, to the point that the action is a representation of the character development, which allows the movie to move at a fast pace without feeling empty. Rey doesn't have this. Her arc is not the product of the story that Disney is trying to tell. Her arc is the product of nostalgia, of wanting the film to feel like the original trilogy without considering what kind of arc would fit Rey best. Alright, let's address the elephant in the room here. The ever-present question of, is Rey too powerful? My answer to that question is that I don't like the question.
It is a trick question.
Why is it a trick question?
Watch this.
I think you can have a powerful hero that's powerful the whole time and doesn't increase in power, and you can make plenty of good stories about that. So instead, I want to ask a different question. Is Rey too powerful for the story that she's in? Personally, in some ways, I kind of think so. I don't think that her being too powerful is inherently bad, but I do think that in some instances, especially upon rewatches, you kind of get the impression that she's a little too powerful given the structure of the story that she's in. Rey was put in the wrong story. An example of this is basically every single moment in The Force Awakens where they emphasize Rey getting a Force power. You have all these moments where Rey mysteriously gets powers, but none of it relates to her character or what she's doing. She just gets powers because the hero of the hero's journey needs to get powers. It's less about what the character needs or overcoming something, and it's more about just, well, the scene needs this, so put it in there. But they also wanted Rey to be a character who was self-sufficient, who didn't need any training, who was innately powerful. Again, this is fine by its own.
Oh, you're a smooth talker. You are.
But it's when you combine those two things that you run into problems. Because the only way to have someone innately powerful, but also have someone have those gain the powers moment, is to give her powers that she already has for no reason. It's just like, oh, I guess she can do that now, or maybe she could do it the whole time. I don't know. Okay, probably the best example of this is at the very end of the movie. Rey force grabs the lightsaber at the end, all triumphant, and is like, oh yeah, look at her, she's grown. It invokes a sort of use the Force Luke moment for her, but unlike Luke, she has had the ability to use the Force the entire time. Rey is already powerful, so a moment showing her be powerful isn't a change of pace. So this moment is trying to look big, but it doesn't really resonate. It feels like it's pretending, like it's going through the motions. It doesn't feel natural. It feels forced. And just like the last issue, these problems make the themes of the film fall flat. This trilogy is all about greatness coming from anywhere. Anyone can switch sides, anyone can be a Jedi. But Rey's power isn't tied to the kind of person she is or what she does. So it seems less like greatness can come from anywhere, and it's more like you too can win the random Force power lottery. Now, in The Rise of Skywalker, we figure out that Rey is a Palpatine. But even if we take the original two movies at face value without considering the third one, the entire everyone can be a Jedi theme still falls flat. Because while Rey may not have been related to anybody who was some powerful Jedi that we knew, she still was powerful for no reason. It's like, yeah, Rey isn't a part of a family, but instead it's more like Rey is the start of a new family that's randomly powerful in the Force. Functionally, it's almost exactly the same as if she came from some old schmuck from the original trilogy. She's powerful because she was born this way. It may not be as explicitly biological as coming from the womb of Leia or midichlorians, but it's pretty close to that. If Rey's power was better characterized, if we had a reason for Rey to be more powerful that came from her personally, rather than just for no discernible reason, I think it would have been fine. The power level isn't really the issue here. It's the lack of context to make it meaningful. To build off of that, not only does the power itself lack context, it also lacks a connection to anything in the plot or what Rey goes through. There was no connection between her emotional struggle and her tangible ones. As we said earlier, she got her powers just randomly, not really as a result of anything she did or who she is. The action and the physical obstacles in her way weren't limited by her emotional state or where she was in her arc. She's a good fighter whether she's on her game or not, which means her main struggle, the one with her parents, never limits her too much and it isn't fully characterized. When we see Rey do things, beat the bad guys, be powerful, bypass the compressor, whatever, most of the time it's not really factoring in the context of her actual emotional struggle. There are some scenes here and there, but for the most part there are two kinds of scenes in the sequel trilogy. The action scenes and the character scenes. And they don't overlap. In a space adventure film with a lot of action, not having a connection between the emotional struggles of the character and the action makes a lot of the movie feel empty, especially when we also don't care about the world this is taking place in. Now, a lot of you may say, well, there's no way to prove definitively that Rey's mood or whatever doesn't have an impact on the action. Well, let's go through that now. Force Awakens. She takes a droid with her to a place not because of her emotional struggle, but because that's just the right thing to do. There is a scene that is affected by her struggle, the one where she runs away crying and that results in her getting captured, but then she escapes, and even if she didn't, her friends were on the way anyway, meaning the actual war fought by the real working people without Daddy's Force powers are out there fighting the good fight, working with their hands, while Rey is just doing her own thing. Again, her struggle is on one side, the plot is on the other. She fights Kylo because she's mad he killed her surrogate father, which was barely developed at all, but whatever. It still doesn't impact much of the actual plot. Nothing in Rey's story impacts the main plot. The Last Jedi is actually marginally better than this, but very marginally. Rey spends the entire movie talking to two people, Luke and Kylo. Kylo she doesn't convince to join the light side, but she does kind of convince to kill Snoke, although the guy had it coming. So maybe it was more like Rey was the straw that broke the Palpatine clone's back. Maybe like half a point. Meanwhile, with Luke, Rey does talk to him, and he does come back to save the day, but that's also implied to be because of Leia. And Yoda. And not as much about Rey and Luke's conversations. So again, half a point. And even then, it's not really anything to do with her arc. Rey is already a good person. When she's talking to Luke, she isn't relating her experiences on Jakku with her parents to him. She's saying, it's the right thing to do. And Luke's like, yeah, but no.
It was a Jedi Master who was responsible for the training and creation of Darth Vader.
And a Jedi who saved him.
It's not, you see what I'm saying? It's not related to her problems. Her problem isn't being a good person. That's not a problem. And then there's The Rise of Skywalker, a nothing movie about nothing, so we can just move on. But yeah, nothing she does has an impact on anything going on around her. Nothing that she learns really makes a difference in anything going on at all. Okay, there's actually one exception. She lifts the rocks at the end of The Last Jedi because she showed up there because she rejected Kylo. But beyond that, nothing. This is why, despite Rey definitely going on a journey in these films, it feels like nothing is happening to so many audiences. I think if we better characterized Rey's struggle, and maybe even characterized her power in the Force as connected to this struggle within her, then her journey would resonate more. It would feel more like, you know, it had a point. The problem is not the power level. It's that it wasn't characterized well within the story. Let's imagine a different scenario where Rey's story was mostly the same, but with a few key differences. Okay, so imagine if we had the same story, but Rey struggled with the dark side more explicitly from the beginning. Imagine if it was also more explicitly stated that the Force in this universe has awakened, not just in the title, but like people actually talk about this as a phenomenon that's happening. We can later reveal that by the Force awakening, they mean the cosmic force has awakened. One that has awakened in response to Luke disconnecting himself from the Force, and this cosmic force is choosing people it feels worthy of carrying it. One of the people who was able to harness the most cosmic force is Rey, someone who has struggled all their life, who's strong-willed and passionate, and someone who will use the Force to shape the world. It doesn't matter if she'll shape it for good or for evil. What matters is that she's doing something that'll have a big impact. So she still earned the power, and it's still connected to her struggles, but she also doesn't need to be trained, so she's technically still doing it on her own. Kylo, meanwhile, is the embodiment of the living Force, someone who is trained by 2 Force Masters, someone of noble blood, someone representing the less ethereal parts of the Force and more physical, more hard magic, more training parts of the Force. Imagine if we still kept the suggestion earlier of Rey's life on Jakku not being part of some random assortment of aliens who don't give her enough portions, but part of a slave colony for the First Order. Maybe when later she's going on an adventure with Finn and Han, she has a bit of a mean streak with the stormtroopers they fight. She flings them around, maybe threatens torture to get information or something out of one of them. She has this anger because the First Order are the people who enslaved her, and they're the people who took away her parents. So she has this deep-seated anger within her. But it's understandable. This anger causes her to be even more powerful, and you can see how her struggle is again fueling the action. Then, imagine if we learn at the end of The Last Jedi in the throne room scene that Rey's parents were nobodies. We'll still keep that plot point, but not only were they nobodies, but that they were killed by a roving band of space pirates in a raid that ultimately decimated Rey's entire town, country, civilization, their land, whatever. And the reason that the space pirates were able to move in the first place is because the New Republic deemed it too dangerous to send reinforcements to certain systems. One of which was Jakku, because hey, it's a desert planet. Not a lot of people are there. It's just a statistic. We don't have time to fight off some space pirates when we have to stop the First Order from rising. I mean, it's the lives of the few versus the many. We have to make a decision. This is about resources, and we don't have enough money. Now, also have the people that ultimately killed the bandits be the First Order. Have the First Order treat the people marginally better than the space pirates, but the First Order are still bad guys. They're using their land to harvest materials for ships and as a fueling depot so that the First Order can get a foothold into that part of the galaxy. So the reason Rey never saw her parents wasn't the First Order. It's because of the New Republic. It's because of the good guys. It's because the people she thought were her family, the people that she thought were on her side, just saw her as an unfortunate statistic in an undeveloped desert.
You have no place in this story. You come from nothing. You're nothing. But not to me.
Now that's the worst news that Rey could hear. Rey has a reason to hate the First Order now, and has more of a connection to the overall battle. She has a reason to want to join Kylo's side beyond just generally being understood. She has a reason to want to use the First Order to create a more peaceful world than the Republic were able to. Through peace, perhaps the need for slavery will end and all the space pirates will go away. And it's almost fitting that Rey and Kylo, embodying both sides of the Force, light and dark, cosmic and living, should end up together as one on the throne. And again, it all connects back to the overall theme of anyone can make mistakes, which is a really, really big theme in The Last Jedi, at least on paper. And then, when you have her reject Kylo in the throne room, it becomes so much more powerful. She's not just rejecting one person. She is rejecting the entire system that put her there. She's better than what she's been through, than what people put her through. And her power can now come from a better place rather than a darker one. And that could be more of her arc. You have her arc come out in different scenes, really characterize her flaws, and have those actions impact what happens next. You have the actions of the main character of this story mean something. And in my opinion, it's still solid drama. I don't know. You guys have to tell me in the comments. But anyway, that's just an example. My point is that while there were elements of Rey's story that I liked, none of it was fully developed or characterized. Because a lot of people felt like they didn't really know the characters of this trilogy.
All the new characters you still barely know after 3 movies have returned.
But why is this? Well, I have a theory. I can't shake the feeling that Disney wanted this trilogy to be so open to possibility that a lot of it felt like empty space. That a lot of it is meaningless and feels vague because they didn't want to overcommit to one idea and not be able to course correct later on. And this, to me, is an even bigger problem than the last one. And I think, again, this is why so many people felt like they didn't really know these characters. Sure, you have their basic personalities, but they could be doing a lot more than they're doing. They could establish backstory, they could be connecting our characters to the world, they could be connecting our characters to each other, but most of their time is spent saying vague lines that sound cool.
Hope is like the sun. If you only believe in it when you can see it.
You'll never make it through the night.
A Kur's weakness, properly manipulated, can be a sharp tool.
Or establishing technobabble.
Then we slice a slit in their shield, blip blappity bloop, and slip right through.
A lot of people would counter this claim by saying that the sequel trilogy, in particular The Last Jedi, are films with more subtext than other Star Wars movies. But I can't help but feel like what some may view as subtext is actually just general vagueness, and this vagueness is a calculated marketing move as a result of how Disney approached this franchise. By that I mean, Disney didn't seem to have a plan here. There were rewrites and reshoots and troubled productions, different director and writer teams in each movie. There was no unifying vision and no way for Disney to know what each movie would shake up to be. And I understand the original trilogy wasn't fully planned either, and there were some changes in who worked on each movie. But it was always Lucas's trilogy. So I can't help but feel that Disney's situation is quite a bit different than Lucas's. Maybe worse. And I can't help but feel that scenes were quote-unquote open to interpretation, not as an artistic choice, but to account for 80 different potential sequels and interpretations from the next director. I feel like if Disney had one crew working on it the entire time, things would be a lot clearer. This is a space adventure franchise for all ages, not The Lobster. Regardless of why they did it though, this resulted in most of the plot lines or themes having this weird sense of plausible deniability to them. Everything in this series feels like it's on the edge of meaning something, but it hasn't made that jump, just in case the next director decides to jump somewhere different. And probably the best example of this are the romances. I want you to think about this statement for a second. Star Wars has always had a romance at the center of its story. Meanwhile, Disney is no stranger to romances, and yet Disney's Star Wars does not have a single explicit, clearly defined, for sure romance in the entire trilogy. And no, it didn't necessarily need to have a romance. The problem isn't the lack of romance so much as the creative failing to follow through on what they themselves set up. Don't believe me?
Got a boyfriend? Cute boyfriend?
None of your business, that's why.
Let's go down the list. Let's talk about Rey and Kylo. I think on paper, it's a really good idea. You can disagree, but that's not really the point here. But just think about it. You have the Luke-Vader dynamic mixed with the romance of Leia and Han Solo. I also like how it's a sort of reverse of Anakin and Padme. It's familiar, but it's just different enough not to be boring. Love is also a bitter temptation for each character to switch sides, adding to the tension. And romance is a much more relatable drive for a bunch of teenagers than stopping your deadbeat dad from being evil. It's a good idea in theory. And yet, there are just as many people that see Rey and Kylo as a couple as people who don't. And I feel like the reason a lot of people may see the romance between Kylo and Rey is because they're the leading man and leading lady, and we expect them to be together. If this was anything other than a leading man and a leading woman, I have a feeling the number of people who saw Reylo would plummet. Why is this? Well, I think it's because Disney didn't have a plan. They didn't know whether a new director would want a romance or not, but at the same time, they want the potential for a romance, right? So they sort of just half did both. I think the theory was that the Reylos would have just enough in the text to go and run with it, and everyone else who didn't want Kylo and Rey together or didn't care could ignore it, and the next filmmaker had the creative freedom to do what they wanted, either going hard into the romance or ignoring it. But it didn't quite work out that way, did it? The vagueness didn't satisfy everyone, it satisfied no one. The Reylos got nothing from Disney. The whole relationship is winks, nods, and arguable symbolism. It's not explicit, it's all implied. As far as the conversations go, there's never an explicit admission of feelings between Rey and Kylo. Even in their forced connections, Rey and Kylo talk about the plot a lot, but not much about their feelings. Visually, there's a shirtless scene, some hand-holding over a fire, and there's a throne room scene that could symbolize something, and one kiss. And even that, they retconned later, saying that it was a friendly kiss? How?
What's this mean on Krypton? Gratitude?
Like, how did Disney no homo straight people? That's like black belt levels of corporate jujitsu. If you were a Reylo, I don't even have to read your fan fiction to know that it's better than anything Disney gave you. And everyone else? Well, they had a mostly empty feeling story about two rivals in the Force they hardly knew, and the shirtless scenes and the kiss at the end felt less like natural parts of the story and more like pandering or like, well, they're the man and the woman, they have to kiss. This is the central romance of the entire trilogy. These are our two main heroes. And nothing is explicit. But it's not the only romance we had in this trilogy.
Got a boyfriend? Cute boyfriend?
None of your business, that's why.
Let's talk about Finn. Poor Finn. He gets shot down not once, not twice, not even 3 times, but 4 times. With Rey, Finn asks her if she has a boyfriend in the beginning of Force Awakens, then he goes on a rescue mission for her, he picks up a lightsaber to defend her, he gets maimed for her, he almost leaves a ship to go to a safe planet so that when she returns from her training, she returns somewhere safe. And in Rise of Skywalker, you know.
Ray! Ray, I never told you Ray! Ray! Ray, come on!
And yet almost nothing happens between them. It could, but maybe Finn is just a really good friend. It could go either way. Now let's talk about Rose and Finn. Rose and Finn go on a mission together, and she helps him through his arc. She helps him become a resistance fighter. Rose stops him from sacrificing himself, and then she kisses him, and then she faints, and then Finn is looking at her like he cares an awful lot over her unconscious body. Is this romantic? I don't know. She kisses him for sure, but you know, that could or could not count. We don't know. Poe and Finn is definitely a different beast.
And their relationship, for me, is, frankly, goes far deeper than a romantic relationship. It is a deep bond that these two have.
It was great. Look, it was a little difficult to see my man kiss somebody else.
She's cool. I just thought there was much more
romance between you two, right?
Part of the reason it didn't happen is so they can sell Star Wars to a very particular market with a very particular kind of censorship, but Disney doesn't make it a straight no either.
This is a rescue. I'm helping you escape.
I'm Luke Skywalker. I'm here to rescue you.
Finn and Poe get in scrapes. Poe is always very happy to see Finn whenever they're on screen together.
We're gonna do this. Yeah?
Oscar Isaac has said in interviews that he felt the relationship was a natural evolution of the characters.
Poe and Finn as a romantic relationship. Was that something that you could see coming at all?
I mean, there was an absolute natural chemistry with him. I immediately felt very connected to him. I remember it was an audition, and the two of us just like did that first scene back to back, butt to butt, just like, and like it was just like immediately all kind of artifice, everything just collapsed, and there was like an intimacy that was very just like there. I think the fact that neither of us shied away from that while we were shooting as well, I think it just was like, these are two guys that, are happy being intimate with each other emotionally. So it wasn't actually a total shock that, people, wanted to, saw that. Personally, I kind of hoped and wished that maybe that would have been taken further in the other films, but, I don't have control over that.
So he was probably trying to convey that in his acting.
Cameron, you're alive. Buddy, so are you. What happened? Got thrown from the crash. I woke up at night, no you, no ship, nothing. BB-8 says that you saved him. You completed my mission, Finn. That's my jacket. Oh. No. Keep it, it suits you. I gotta talk to you about something. I gotta talk to you about something. I can't do this alone. I need you in command with me.
Well, this droid has it. Thank you. I appreciate that. General.
Come on, you know that, John. Don't pretend. Hey, you know whose cheeks those are. That's Oscar's bubble.
There's an appearance of romantic tension.
I'll tell you later.
You mean when Poe's not here?
Yeah.
We're gonna die in sand burrows and we're all keeping secrets?
I'll tell you when you tell us about all that shifty stuff you do.
Just enough so that people who want them together can draw fan art, but there's nothing concrete. All of these relationships feel less like fully fleshed out things and more like potential threads that a director could pull on in the next movie. When JJ made Rose kiss Finn, all I can think now is he put that in there just in case the next director wanted to see them together. Whenever I see Finn and Poe together, I think China needs to get its stuff together. Whenever I see Finn and Rey, I think what happens with the romance also is what happens with nearly everything else in the trilogy. You want Rey to be evil? Well, don't have her actually do evil things and weigh the consequences and just don't have her commit to it. Just have her shoot lightning out of her hand and imagine her shark tail alter ego. You want Kylo to go from bad to good? Well, have him sort of run in place for 3 movies going back and forth until he just suddenly turns light side out of nowhere because Rey stabs him in the belly. It's like there isn't a gradual change to anything. There's no cohesiveness. There's no like this was being built to. It's just these jarring back and forth shifts. These thread starters until they finally pick a side to land on, and then they have to quickly resolve the thread just as quickly as they built it up. Why have Finn be a stormtrooper or force sensitive? Well, it's a cool thread. Maybe they'll use it, maybe they won't. Just throw it in there. Like, why not? This whole trilogy is just like notes. It's just notes. There's no flow. There's no thread. There's no forward momentum. It's just all potential. So what now? Now that my voice is shot and I'm trying to drink water to keep it up, but it can't, what do we do? Well, I think Disney wants these films to sell. So here's my 2 cents as someone that was completely burned away from this trilogy. I think if Disney wants these films to really resonate in the future with all audiences, not just the people who love Star Wars no matter what, or people who grew up with these characters so they have nostalgia for them, it needs to pick a direction and go there. Romance, no romance, somebody, nobody, make a decision, and if it's well written, the people will follow. It needs to focus on what I outlined here. It needs to flesh out the conflict of the universe. It needs to make sure the characters are linked to this conflict, and it needs to actually commit to a direction for the characters and for the plot for an entire trilogy. There needs to be a plan, and there needs to be a universe. I would love to still care about Star Wars, but that love has to be earned. And Disney, you got a lot of work to do.